All right. Good evening, everyone. This is Paul Fahrenheit, and I'm here with the Kid Ace. All right. And we are going to be discussing a topic which has kind of been on my mind recently. I brought it up to Ace a couple of days ago, and we talked about it for a little bit, and we decided something that it's very good to discuss, especially now. As things seem so uncertain with it, but what we want to discuss is particularly the soul of America. What is the soul of America? What does it consist of? What aspects of it should be discussed? Is it as simple as the founding stock of America? If it is, then what is the founding stock? What does it entail? Is it as simple as it's just a bunch of Anglos that are LARPing as various other ethnicities, or are there actual, were there actual other sorts of groups of people? And America is kind of just an amalgamation of the West, almost in line with the sort of shit lib idea of America as an idea and not a nation. Um, but if it's not just the people, then what is the soul of America? Is it America's culture or lack thereof? Is it, if it is the American culture, and I use that term very lightly, is it the literature? Is it the music? Is it the paintings? Is it what is it? And finally, once we if me and Ace can come to a conclusion as to what the soul of America is and what it entails, or at least sort of feel around in the dark for it, what is the future of it? You know, they say you need to know where you've come from before you know where you're going. Well, no one seems to really know where the fuck America is going right now. And I feel like with this historical work, our mutual friend Thomas 777's revisionist history, which I think very much fits in this mold of what we're going to be discussing. Once we discover the truth, or at least a better version of the truth than what we have now, I think we'll be able to discern what the destiny, to use the Spenglerian term, what the destiny of America is, and I think as a whole what the destiny of the West is. All right, but we'll get into that a bit later. Yeah, you have anything to add on that, Ace?
Yeah, I agree that America, if we're going to define it based on the people, then it is the list that you had on your Twitter thread on your Twitter account. And I think that the descendants or the ancestry is or heritage rather is sort of a key to this question that we're asking.
Very much so. Very much so. I don't think it just begins and ends with race, whether it be biological or in the Yakiite sense of the word, in a more metaphysical sense. But the distinction does need to be drawn. Scott Greer recently, he talks about how America is an Anglo nation. And I understand the sentiment. I understand the idea that yes, the country was founded by the English crown. Yes, the common language there is English, and it is the language we still speak to this day. At the same time, that's kind of sweeping a whole bunch of other shit that occurred from the years of 1607 to 1776. All right, and then afterwards, right? But you know, I I mentioned this in my thread. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. You had everyone, right? Not just from the various domains held by the Stuarts, and then William and Mary, and then later the Hanoverian monarchs. Not just people from those domains. All right, you had pretty much everyone from Western Europe coming into the United States. Before independence, when it was simply the colony. For example, my family, my mother's paternal line, my family was the first, one of the first Germans to be brought into the state of Virginia. All right, and that was in 1714. Right, this wasn't in like 1864 or 1865 when when everyone says the Germans came in. This was in 1714. All right, one of several families. One of those families later became a governor of Virginia. Um, and there was a whole. They founded a place called Germana, abandoned it, went further up north, and were among the first to settle the Shenandoah Valley. But they were not the last Germans to go into the Shenandoah Valley. You know, I My family coming from the Shenandoah Valley, I'm biased towards that region in particular, but it's a nice little microcosm. The settling of the valley is a microcosm of what was sort of happening throughout the rest of the South. Not so much New England, but to a lesser extent, the entire rest of the 13 colonies, which was there were multiple groups of people settling these areas. Right, the Germans founded their little towns that they named German names on the Shenandoah River and other rivers. The English were founding their little villages and hamlets based around plantation houses, and the Scots Irish, which were the Ulster Scots and the sort of borderland Scots, right around Northumbria and around Belfast. They were kind of a problem because they had these weird, I think, very white, very Aryan notions of freedom and clannishness and values that would later, I think, transition to the Old South. And so the English crown kind of wanted to get rid of them, and more than a few of them ended up in the foothills and the mountains of the Old South, of the Alleghenies and the Blue Ridge, right? And these people, yeah, sure, they may have spoken a little bit of English, but they were not Anglos per se, right? They were not necessarily loyal servants of the Stuarts and then later the House of Hanover. So I just want to draw attention to this to speak nothing of New England, which I know lesser about, but I do know a little bit. The Dutch that settled the Hudson River from New Amsterdam all the way up to Albany, which I think was used to be called Fort Orange. Um, while they may have been small in number and very quickly sort of ethnically replaced, that sort of spirit of the earth, that sort of spirit of the land with Dutch sensibilities remained. All right. Even to this day, where New York, I think the colors on the city flag are orange, white, and blue, which were the colors of the old 13 provinces. Um, so it's things like that. Um, New England for sure, though, unless I'm drastically oversimplifying, New England for sure is more or less pure Anglo. All right, but they're a particular type of Anglo. There's not just one type of Anglo. It's like all the Puritans in my Twitter thread, and this is a general idea that I keep saying. America was the result, I guess you could say, of planting two seeds, and those two seeds fell from the same tree, that being the tree of England. But they fell from the tree of England during the English Civil War, and they were planted in America. One was planted in Plymouth, one was planted in Jamestown, both of which were entirely different colonies and with entirely different, conceptual bases. All right, and they both grew into the ideas of North and South, which still very much exist to this day, although they're somewhat muted in mainstream discourse, but they do exist today. And the rest of the regions of the country can sort of draw their lineage from that sort of north-south division. So forgive me, Ace, I kind of went rambling a little bit, but do you have anything to add to that, or any sort of insights or critiques of that sort of point of view?
Sure. Well, when you talk about all the distinctions, I can imagine sort of the Twitter reaction to hearing a lot of those different factions that were in the early stages of the American settlement. And I know that there's a lot of underreporting for it. And when you look at stuff like 19th century historical documents, it seems like a lot of that stuff kind of gets neglected. And so maybe that's the purpose of there's sort of a lack of education in that department. And maybe that can kind of clear people's minds a little bit to kind of understand some of those differences. But honestly, I am pretty sympathetic to some people who say that, a lot of the settlements in the early colonies, I don't know if there's anything worth arguing about that today. I know that sort of back then it was a lot more personal, since you're talking about families, you're talking about a lot of different people who are sort of figuring out America in this new part of the world. So I do kind of understand some of the discourse that happens on Twitter when we're getting into these very distinct parts of the early American story.
Yes, that's true. But to sort of kind of counter that point, I mean, yeah, sure. We don't exactly have, villages of Germans in the valley or otherwise, speaking German to each other anymore. The Huguenots, most of which after La Rochelle fell, the Huguenots, which were French Protestants, very largely emigrated to the United States, and settled there. Right. So we don't really have Huguenot villages of people speaking French to each other just across the east coast of the South. All right, but at the same time, I don't want to sound like a shitlib when I say this, but it's like by virtue of these people being essentially cousin peoples with essentially 96% similar world conceptions, only disagreeing on minor things. Without a doubt, they influenced each other. Without a doubt, they're sort of what's the word? Proximity. Their proximity to each other definitely influenced what their children will become. They intermarried. They started picking up slang from each other's languages, and over time, as I think it was destined, there was sort of a and you did still have lineages, sure, but that's where the sort of the Amerimut idea comes from. Is there a single American who's white that that who can't say to you, oh well, I'm Irish, but I'm also German and I'm English and et cetera, right? And that was the contention I was making in that Twitter thread, is that, yeah, sure, I dislike mongrelizing as much as the next guy, but at the same time, right, these are all from one, people, one conceptual horizon, one cultural horizon, that being that of the West, of Western Europe, which at the end of the day is Gothic. All right. All of these people are Gothic with various different sort of removals from there, or I get at least Indo-Aryan, right? And that's the reason I bring that up, and I make the emphasis that yes, this is correct. But by the time of the Civil War, PGT Beauregard grew up speaking French. You know, on the Union side, Siegel, Franz Siegel, who was the primary German general, I believe he was an immigrant, but he had his whole armies were all of German extraction, and many of them were natives, or at least natives in the sense of like their families had been there for 100 years. Right? You still had Huguenot families in Charleston at the outbreak of the Civil War speaking French. Right? You had Scots Gaelic and Irish Gaelic speakers. I guess the Civil War really is the watershed moment, though, when all of those sort of regional cultures, their heyday kind of gets hit with a sledgehammer. Um, but that's the reason why I bring it up, is because these identities of North and South and all of the various iteration of those identities amongst America are very much a result of these people, even if their explicit influence on your day to day life has greatly diminished.
Yeah, well, to speak on the the cultural implications from the 19th century, I'd like to move to the 20th because I think that's when we start to get yet another group. We start to get the Italians and the Irish and their chapter in the American story, and I think it's sort of interesting now because this is another infamous topic on Twitter that seems to come up regularly, and so everybody chooses their sides to sort of defend their honor. But it seems like when in the 20th century, a couple things. I want to eventually get to the literacy because I know that you're well read in that department and more well read than me about the 20th century authors. But I first want to start with your thoughts on the Catholic contribution to America, since, as you said, you've had these factions of different types of Protestants. How do the Catholics fit in this story?
So this is something that that kind of gets brushed over by some people, but the Catholics have been here since the very beginning. America is a Protestant nation. This is beyond a shadow of a doubt because it is an Anglo nation, and the Anglos are more or less inherently Protestant. However, everyone points to the example of Maryland and how Maryland was initially founded as a sort of haven for Catholics, and this very quickly ended but that sort of spirit, for better or for ill, remained within Marylanders and what I would, what you could call the Mid-Atlantic. Um, and that was founded, St. Mary's, for example, is the earliest settlement in Maryland. That was founded as a Catholic colony. So later on, as the Irish and the Italians came in, although I must note that both an Irishman and an Italian signed the Declaration of Independence, um, but the Irishmen and the Italians coming in, mostly this was as a result of, as everyone knows, is being taught in Holocaust history class. They mostly came as a result of, the famines in the case of the Irish, and in the case of the Italians, the Risorgimento, which was the unification of Italy under Giuseppe Garibaldi. And most of the Italians that came here were Southern Italians. They didn't want to live under the new sort of Republican government, or even though it wasn't necessarily a Republican government, but it was more Republican than they were used to. Many were criminals. Many were other just sort of dregs, or people who wanted to come. Same reason that, Central Americans come here now is, it was a bountiful place where money could be made, and so they came here. But the Italians and the Irish, I, this may make me some enemies, but to me, they've always been here because they're another part of the West. Sure, they're, they're the parts of the West that everyone shit talks, but, who among our sort of spheres would say that Ireland is not a European country, Italy is not a European country? Like, yeah, I get it. The Med versus Nord divide, which I think is stupid, but, because they're just two different sides of the same coin, being the West. Um, but, even America being a Protestant nation, well, America being a Protestant nation means it takes some of its conceptual horizon from the Catholic Church, because, Protestants, like it or not, you do come from the Catholic Church, and you did keep some of the same conceptual horizons, especially in terms of church structure and liturgy and the like. It was. I don't want to. I don't want to make a false equivalence and say nothing changed, and I'm not as educated as I could be in that department, but, as an outsider looking in, that seems obvious to me. I hope that answers your question. Let me know if I could clarify a bit on that.
No, no, I think that that's very relevant. And I also want to talk about the literature that was happening during the 20th century. We mentioned two authors before the show, before the first show, that is. And I think that that plays a big role in sort of tapping into the American psyche at the moment, because as someone mentioned in the comments here, there's certain things that Americans don't really contribute to the West the way that they did back in Europe. And I think the example he gave was opera, or classical music rather. And so I'd like you to speak on the literature that exists in America, since that also influenced the film industry, which was very different than the way it is now. So,
Sure. Yeah. So the two authors we were talking about beforehand, was Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, who were very much, talk about two different sides of the same coin. I very much see them as the 20th century apotheosis of the respective northern and southern identity. Um, H.P. Lovecraft being born and raised in New England, being a very scholastic, scholarly man, and Robert E. Howard being born and raised in the plains of Texas, very much seeing the end of the Wild West with his own eyes. Um, but I speak of those because I was reading an article put out on I think Castilia House is the name of the website. It's one of the publishing houses that Vox Day and other people friendly to our spheres have been writing for. But it was a short little excerpt of a letter, or a series of letters that Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft had been sending back and forth to each other about immigration, where basically H.P. Lovecraft is bemoaning what he calls the mongrelized Italians, the ever-present, I guess the joke would be, we would say the eternal Anglo, but he was saying like the eternal Italian. Um, and Robert E. Howard was very much talking about the same thing in his letter back to H.P. Lovecraft, speaking of the Mexicans in Texas and the other sort of Latinos. Um, And that's very much a spirit that was ever present during the not just the 19th century or the 20th century rather, but the late 19th century. And it's because, en masse, these people were mostly sticking to coastal cities. They weren't really leaving or going inland the way that, these earlier people I mentioned did. The Huguenots went inland. The Germans went inland. The Scots Irish went inland. So they all sort of carved out places. And yeah, they were close to each other, but they had enough distance from each other where I think they were able to develop over time, intermarry, and almost I don't want to say they melded or assimilated, but became a fabric in a way that cousins could be, right? The Italians and the Irish were a bit further cousin. They were a bit more distant. As Donald Trump said, they also weren't sending their best. So I think that's what sort of contributes. And I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, and also the assimilation was a lot different back then, and the language was also closer together. And I think we even take some of our language from Latin, and so as you said, there's a closer connection there, and I think a lot of that is underreported. But to speak on the literature from the 20th century, my sort of introduction into this topic comes more under the guise of the film industry, because during the early days of Hollywood, I know our side is sort of detests Hollywood at any given moment, but there was a time when Hollywood had this thing called the Haze Code.
Hmm.
Had a lot of conservatives in the film industry, and even somebody like I think it's William B. Hayes was voted Republican and things like that. So there was a time when you sort of had right wing infrastructure in the entertainment industry, and a lot of the topics, or the adaptions in Hollywood, was based on these books that you were talking about earlier. And so there was kind of that connection, sort of romanticism, that was very popular in the early 20th century, and that kind of speaks to the type of entertainment that we kind of went away from, and as the century went on.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that. You being a Californian, you probably by proximity know more about the entertainment industry than I do. However, my father, he was a man who earlier in his life worked on film score, and he worked in Los Angeles for a time as a recording artist. Many notable names came into the studio he worked at, but from him, I kind of learned that yeah, that the Hays Code era. You talked about there's some almost conservative infrastructure within Hollywood. Yes, of course, because Hollywood wasn't founded at least as far as I know, wasn't founded as an institution by a certain group of people. Um, but it was just infiltrated as time went on. But as you talk about the sort of Hays Code era, yeah, a lot of that I think is the purview and the result of the works of William Randolph Hearst, or at least his sort of lingering influence, and also largely Walt Disney, because Walt Disney very much was a sort of bulwark against these sort of, and he was there all the way towards the end of it, back when he saw, when he saw these crypto communist actors with certain ethnic affiliations coming into Hollywood. As a matter of fact, there was a stream that AA was doing on his channel a couple of weeks ago, looking at old school movies or little short films from this kind of era we're talking about. And many of the actors in them, they stop and they comment like, this guy was a member of the CPUSA or something to that effect. These guys weren't even subtle about it. They were like straight up socialist assets. And so you do see that degradation over time. I think that the repeal of the Hays Code was honestly just a sort of making de jure what was already de facto in Hollywood, because there's a movie, I think it was called The Pawn Shop or The Pawnbroker. That was like the first big movie. You could call it the first big modern movie with like modern themes, in terms of like pure callousness of the movie and the violence and degradation of the characters. But movies like that had kind of been slipping through the cracks anyway. And as the spirit of the age shifted, so too did the United States and its view on entertainment. But speaking as you said, like in the early 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? Um, Going on into the 60s, that's kind of was America's cultural contribution. Was all of these movies about different periods. You have Ben-Hur, you have you probably I'm not a big movie head. You probably know some more than I do, but you do have these movies like apothesizing with the spaghetti westerns as sort of the greatest. Yeah, they were directed by an Italian, but they were American movies, without a doubt. Um, and that's sort of like the apotheosis of America almost writing its soul into being. The Wild West didn't look like the Dollars trilogy, but that's kind of what America convinced itself the Wild West did look like, because they're very good movies. They're fantastic pieces of art, and they're just plausible enough, and just unrealistic enough to sort of make a myth into being. So that's my sort of comment on these on the Hollywood film industry. It did kind of it brought into being these stories that I sit here and talk about, and that people like Robert E. Howard wrote about towards the end of his life. They brought them into being in a way that people could perceive them, you know, in ways they hadn't before. This was before the whole Hollywood film thing was corrupted and turned into a propaganda machine. And some of the more black pilled among us might say it was a propaganda machine even back then. But I like my old school movies. That's all I can say. You got anything to add to that?
No, no, I think we're in full agreement there with holding on to the old Hollywood. I know people dismiss it outright, but I do agree with you that it was authentic at one point. And that was a good point you made about the Italian connection with the American film industry. For anyone who wants to dismiss or have any slander towards the Italian connection to the American story, we do have to remember that it was Italians that sort of contributed to this Americana film style. So I think a lot of scholars of film will appreciate that, and it sort of syncs up with our politics. But the other thing I wanted to say was interesting was how the Haze Code actually dissolved in the 60s, which is perfect timing, as we know, because that's when you started to have the counterculture revolution, the sexual revolution. That's when norms, it's basically another enlightenment. It's a modern enlightenment in America. So
Well,
yeah, go for it.
I don't mean to interject, but as our mutual friend Thomas would say, I think these were all artificially created. The repeal of the Hays Code had massive popularity. You know, the sexual revolution and all of that was like actively promoted by bad faith actors, in order to achieve their sort of political goals via social disruption, right? Um, and if Thomas were, you'd probably go into like a whole further like rant into, I wouldn't say a rant because it would be good stuff, but he'd get into more detail in it than I do. But these are the type of people that Dr. Revelo P. Oliver kind of talks about when he was writing articles for the John Birchers in sort of these were not Soviet assets who were causing this social degradation and this bottom up sort of dissolving of culture from the government. These were very much homegrown people who caused this shift to occur. And I think who are also greatly responsible for the repression and the destruction of regional American identities.
Right, for sure. And to speak on that, the fact that this is all also happening simultaneously with the Cold War, which Thomas could also go into a whole summary with, I think that the cultural dynamics in society should probably be treated with more, if not the same amount of severity as the Cold War, because the culture wars is something that is social. And not to completely dismiss the Cold War, I know that that's also become normalized on our side, is sort of the complete dismissal of this sort of war games politics that maybe most of us don't really fully understand, and so we just sort of write it off. But I do think that it's not by mistake that the Cold War and the culture wars of the 60s are kind of simultaneously happening, and we can kind of debate about which one of these is kind of worth thinking about seriously, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, of course. And the reason that I think America itself, to kind of take a step back a little bit, the reason America itself is of such importance that we've dedicated a show talking about it, particularly in regards to the culture war, is that following the end of the Second World War, the Second World War was a war of succession over which power would be the primary power of the West between the mid-century Germans and the United States. The United States won, for good or for ill, and has retained that great power status, so that primary power status of the West up until this point. And I think that position, if nothing else, that position lends to it a massive sort of importance uh, that it still fulfills. Like right now, you've got bad actors and our enemies currently at the levers of culture, um, but at the same time, how many people do you know of that are in this thing that we're in who are young American kids, right? I'd say Americans make up the bulk of this thing, these sort of spheres that we're in. Um, I don't want to say mostly because America isn't paused yet, but the other countries being paused, you could say is the fault of America. But and forgive me if I'm being broad or if I'm reaching around or trying to fill the dark at it, but I do think that there's an inherent importance in the United States, not so much the United States as much as America, in terms of the sort of cultural idea of what the West is, even if it is shallower than, let's say, somewhere like Germany or France.
Yeah, well, I think Generation Z is going to sort of appropriate these things, whether the boomers want them to or not. I think they're going to nostalgically kind of take these things from the boomers, the authoritative traditions that have been neglected. I think a lot of that stuff is going to come back in style because they're going to be so tired of the nihilism that's been kind of the norm for who knows how long at this point. But I just think young people are going to they're really going to start looking at these things. And I think a lot of these things are going mainstream. And so a lot of the hard work's already done for us.
Mm.
But I think when we're looking at the culture war today, I think it's very easy to make an academic statement about, sort of how we got here. And I know that sounds pretty broad, but I'm just trying to say, I think young people are sort of coming to our side, and, it's very rational too. It's not like, we've got it. Well, I mean, if you go on Twitter, you're probably going to disagree with that. There's a lot of, irrational people sort of trying to represent this sort of right-wing movement. But I think that there's a lot of, well-spoken, very articulate people that are sort of coming around, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, and we have to sort of be careful when we start going into this territory because a lot of Gen Z are trash. I think the Gen Zs that are worth saving are coming around to this side of things, because this really I do agree with Bronze Age pervert when he says that this is the only side of not just the internet but the world where real culture is still being created, where it's still existing. Um, and I've said that before, and I'll say again that I think that's the greatest advantage of this side of things, is the creation of culture. Right, culture in the sense of how Yaki describes it. Culture isn't just sitting there and writing a poem and posting it on your little Substack, even though I do that. But culture is also techniques, right? Culture is learning how to build and run a factory. Culture is learning how to carve a statue. Culture is learning how to organize a business on the grounds of what the Western business model is, on what the Western culture is. And to bring this back to sort of America from the broader sense of it, the potential for all of this, right? The potential for all of this making itself felt in the real world still lies with the United States, right? It is the only place that is capable of affecting all of the other places. Everyone talks about Eric Zemmour and the French and all that, and yeah, that's all well and good. Um, Even if Zemmour isn't some bad actor, um, but France, influential as it is, if some right winger takes over in France, well, who else freaking cares, How's the rest of the West gonna react to that? Well, not really, not at all. But Donald Trump comes into office. It took everything. I think it really did take everything that the powers that be had to sort of crush that movement, right? But that's a vacuum that will be filled, right? Either by us or by someone else. And that's why I emphasize the importance of America. America to Europe is Rome as to Greece, right? You don't think or remember of you think of a couple of great Roman writers, but they were people like Tacitus, who is a historian, or Cicero, who was a political orator, right? Or Julius Caesar, who was a sort of great conqueror. But those are you don't really think of great Roman writers. Maybe who wrote? I'm not a classical historian, but I guess the guy who wrote the Ennead. Forgive me, Chad, if you guys know. But you don't think really when you think of Rome, you don't necessarily think of its writers. You don't think of its artists or its sculptors. You think of the legions. That's like the second thing, or the first thing you think of when you think of Rome. You think of Rome, legions, emperors. That's what you think of, and that's because Rome was the part of the Greco-Roman Apollonian culture. Rome was the part that was political and military and economic. All right, Rome's greatest strengths were its military, its administrators, and to a lesser extent, its merchants. Right, that is how Rome built its power. That's how America built its power. America. I could list off a whole bunch of writers from the American tradition, going all the way back to Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, you know Leaves of Grass. What's his name? I'm sorry. The names. The names. You know the works they do, and you know what their style is, but you forget the names while you do it. But I could name you a whole bunch of a whole tradition from all the way back to Nathaniel Hawthorne in New England, all the way up until Thomas Pynchon, who I think is one of the, although his novels have dropped off in quality, he's one of the last sort of great living American novelists. Him and Cormac McCarthy before him, and Faulkner and Hemingway, although I'm loath to mention his name. Other gentlemen like that, right? There is a great sort of American literary tradition, in that sense. But the thing that always comes to me when I consider that is, are they notable because they are great writers, or are they notable because they are American writers? And that's the thing I always have to ask myself, and I apply that to pretty much everywhere where people talk about notable Americans.
Yeah, that is interesting. The idea that those writers did from a very specific place, and maybe they got that sort of, they cut their teeth on this sort of Americana mindset. Do you think people our age could, because I know you're a very well-read person, so do you recommend sort of the nostalgic revival of some of this American literature? Because you know more than anybody that this stuff's been neglected. Do you think that these authors do carry a lot of that culture that can sort of communicate a lot to people that are probably fixated on movies or anything else?
Well, yes and no. I dislike Americana in the way, like the concept of Americana. America isn't 1950s diners. America is not Coca-Cola signs. America is not Ford Motor Company. America is not, the latest movie that's on the movie screen. America is not the television. America is not all of these things that everyone traditionally thinks of, or I wouldn't say traditionally, past 100 years or so, thinks of when they think of America. America is a people. You know, Americans are a people. The same way that Frenchmen are a people, the same way that Spaniards are a people. The same way that Englishmen, that Germans, everywhere. I know that you have, oh, I'm not a German, I'm a Bavarian, or oh, I'm not a Frenchman, I'm an Occitan, or some shit like that. Yeah, I get it, right? Yes, there are subdivisions. And in many ways, those nations I just outlined to you, you could make an argument that they're somewhat artificial concepts. But America is no less artificial than these other places. America is a pre-modern nation. Uh, that's the I think that's the thesis of Albion Seed, which is probably one of the best histories of pre-independence America I've ever read, where the author goes into the various different English peoples that came and went to certain parts of the country. But but the reason I outline this is because America had an ethnogenesis. It did. People say it didn't, but it did, right? All of these people recognize themselves as the founding stock of America. And that word that seems so, ubiquitous today, white, that was the denoter, white. That did not it didn't exist in the same way that it did before America codified it into the one of the requirements of citizenship. To the external barbarian, whether they be Native American or African or whomever, right? There's no difference to them between a Dutchman and a German, or an Englishman and a Spaniard. They're all white to them, you know, and that's the thing, that is the denoting, that is the synthesis of all of the peoples of the West into the white tribe, as some have said before. And that's sort of why I try to make the point that America is the apotheosis of the West, the whole of the West, from the Oder, uh, I guess count on Prussia, from Königsberg down to the Alps, down through the Italian peninsula to Iberia, all the way up to the British Isles. All of that is the founding stock of the West. Sure, the Anglos were the most numerous at first, but regardless, the founders still venerated Germans, right? This isn't, I don't want this to be misconstrued as that like America is an idea and it's open to all peoples. It's not. It's not. A half breed, half caste from Mexico cannot be an American the same way that a German can be an American, or a German whose family settled here 300 years ago became an American, right? An African despite being here pretty much as long as the white man was, cannot be an American the same way that a Dutchman whose family has been in the Hudson River Valley for 400 years can be. Do you get this point? Does this make sense to you? Like, it's not like the gates need to be thrown open. That's not the consequence of this idea. This is America is the final conclusion of a historical, I don't want to say a historical process, but it's the final conclusion sort of how the spirit of the West is manifesting itself on the earth.
Right. And as you said, the Spenglerian cycle of America, it's we're all different. And so to kind of categorize America as this catch-all term, that's sort of the first mistake. If we're going to define terms as we did at the beginning of the show, we have to first talk about sort of the early people that were here and how did we get all the way to today. So to kind of, as you know, just the American as sort of the proverbial, everyman. I remember you said earlier, you were talking about after the 40s, when America was the superpower, they basically were the geopolitical superpower in culture as well. So the fact that America is sort of the default, it would be like the default character in a video game in people's minds. I think that sort of speaks to the ignorance of, we've got ancient Greece history, we've got the Enlightenment, the world history is bigger than this nation that has only really been in existence for a relatively short time compared to everybody else. So,
Well, yeah, and that's true, but there's a reason, yes, comparatively, America is a nation that's existed for a short time if you count it since independence. But if you go back to 1607, which I consider the true founding of it, right, when what was essentially a mining conglomerate, sent a bunch of people with mercenaries to protect them into wild country. It would be the equivalent of, like, in some sci-fi setting, some megacorp finds a new planet and hires mercenaries to set up a mining colony on that planet. That's what Jamestown was. That's what and people raise eyebrows when I put it in those terms. That's basically what it was, and that's kind of where the I don't want to say the entrepreneurial spirit, but that's kind of where the adventurous, conquering spirit um, that the South exemplify, but Americans also as a whole kind of imbibed. That's where that comes from, or at least where it was most recently deposited, because I think that's a spirit that's always existed. And so when you say yes, in the grand scheme of things, America is a blip on the map. But in the grand scheme of things, the West is a blip on the map, right? America exists for a reason. It is around for a reason. It was founded almost entirely without any sort of meaningful opposition, except for the Civil War, um, and became the biggest power on Earth for a reason, right? It fell for a reason. We exist, us two different Americans from two opposite sides of the countries talking about this is happening for a reason. I don't mean to get metaphysical on everyone, but America has a purpose. America has a destiny, and one it must fulfill, in my opinion. Um, and that's why, as you mentioned earlier, these writers who speak to the soul of America, not through Americana, but through something a lot more timeless and eternal, right? America is just the repository for an idea that has always existed. The same way that Prussia was the repository of the idea that the Spartans upheld, of pure military valor, right? That's a way of being that can exist. America is the imperial way of being. At least it's trying to be. It's struggling to bring it into existence. I don't think it exists right now.
I hear you. I hear you. I sort of want to wrap up on something that I may get a little bit of flack for, but I think it is relevant when we're talking about the culture wars. You know, that term culture war derived from Otto von Bismarck's Culture Kampf. I'm probably
Hmm.
mispronouncing that, but everybody knows. But I do think to speak on timeless ideas or sort of proof in the pudding of how something sort of transcends just the obvious corporate, Americana label. I think I just want to say this real quick that in Germany during Bismarck's time, for him to basically lose to the center party, that when he was trying to wage a war against the Catholics, I think when we're talking about how do you know when something is true or sort of transcends this world, I think it does kind of speak volumes when you have sort of and to compare it to the American population before the 20th century, the fact that you had Catholics in Germany that were able to basically overpower, Bismarck, who, is a very impressive statesman. I think that speaks to the power of the people, sort of this sort of thing that motivates them in a time of a culture struggle,
Yep.
to get the deriving that term from. But I just wanted to kind of compare those two together because Americans used to have, a very different spirit. And I just wanted to make that comparison between the two.
So in terms of the culture conf, it must not be misunderstood. The Catholics had their own local elites, both the clergy and the minor. There were some minor nobles. There were also a very large influx of what in a previous era was called burghers, but I guess would be called the middle class. I guess, yeah, that's late enough to call them the middle class. But also, the Catholics were very heavily concentrated around industrialized areas. You know, the places in Germany where you'll find the most Catholics are the Rhineland and Bavaria. Those are the places where you will find Catholics. And well, what are the two places that have the most industry in them? Oh, as you look at that, the Rhineland and Bavaria. So yes, you're right. There is a power of the people, but we must return to the sort of Italian elite theory, which explains literally everything. Which was the fact that, yeah, sure, maybe the people, quote unquote, made their voice heard against Bismarck, but it was very much the local elites and the national elites who happen to be whose interests happen to be aligned with those particular areas, leveraging the Catholics' hold on those areas, at least disproportionately. I'm not saying all industrialized areas were Catholic, but was able to leverage that influence and the influence of the powers that be against Bismarck. So yes, you're right. The people do need to make their voice heard in the sense of like we being the people, in the sense of our spheres. At the same time, we need to sort of internalize how that is done, and how that is done is through the establishment of parallel institutions, new local elites, and getting people who are sympathetic or friendly to us into the national spotlight. All right, assuming that the secret police don't get sent to all of our house tomorrow.
Exactly, exactly. Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on, and it looks like we had a lot of comments here. But thank you again, Paul. I really appreciate you. It's good to talk to a fellow Zoomer.
Of course.
This has usually been, bogged down in some Boomer history, but it's very nice to be talking to one of us, man. It really is a treat. But anyways, I'm gonna have to. But anyways, thank you again, Paul. I appreciate it, man.
Of course.